Hello there. This is the second video of five, debriefing my second CRISSP lecture, which is on Spanish conjugation with special reference to PYTA. I'm going to suppose that you've watched the first part of this, which was on the morphosyntactic part of the analysis, which is largely taken off the shelf, like most of the assumptions about the morphosyntax of the Spanish verb and of the crucial rules of exponents are there already in previous literature, in particular by James Harris and Carlos Oregui and Iggy Roca. One substantive innovation of mine, which I'll briefly recap before we get on to the main order of business here, is the characterization of the distribution of the suppletive allomorphs that play a role in giving rise to the PYTA pattern. So allow me to just make this full screen. And that is the idea that the PYTA cells of the paradigm that involve suppletion of some sort are sensitive to the features minus present plus finite. That characterization, I think, is original to me. And then the idea is that the imperfect indicative, despite having these features as part of the piece and as part of the meaning, doesn't pattern with the other tenses that bear those features because of a special impoverishment rule that deletes the feature minus present in that crucial environment. And then the future indicative and the conditional don't participate in PYTA for a different reason, and that's because of their syntactic structure. So those are built on the infinitive, and so the relevant theme vowel is local to a TAM morpheme, a TAM morpheme, which doesn't have minus pres plus fin on it because it's the infinitive marker, right? With that in place, you get the distribution of the relevant suppletive allomorphs by rules that look like this pair, which is a sample pair of rules for the verb querer. So you're spelling out querer, the root of querer as quis in that environment, the environment of a minus present tense plus finite tam morpheme, and then you spell it out as care with an extra floating CV sequence elsewhere. And that floating sequence is going to give rise to diphthongization. So that's where we landed last time. This video is about the non-automatic vowel alternations that occur in Spanish and which sort of tessellate with the morphosyntactic generalization here to give rise to the illusion of PYTA. So we're about to get into some fairly serious phonology. So serious enough that this section has its own roadmap. So section 5.1 introduces my assumptions about the melodic tier, which are taken from the theory known as logical phonology. Section 5.2 tells you what I'm assuming about the timing tier, which is taken from the theory known as strict CV. And I'll say something about how to make strict CV and logical phonology talk to each other, because they're not usually paired in this fashion. Section 5.3 introduces the key rules and sample derivations, many of which are taken off the shelf. They've been part of analyses of Spanish for quite some time, with one especially important exception having to do with the diphthongal alternate of the theme vowel of the third conjugation and apparently second conjugation, but just in cases where it merges with the third conjugation morphologically, right? And then section 5.5 is an interim conclusion. And then this particular video will finish the concluding section 6 of the main text of the handout, and that's where it will end. And then subsequent videos will look over the appendices of the handout, which I remind you is 60 pages long. All right, here we go. Assumptions about the melodic tier. So this is a primer on logical phonology, which is a theory of phonology initiated by Charles Rees and colleagues. So here are some references with Rees in various collaborations. This theory was being called for a while rational phonology, and the name was changed, I assume, because people didn't like the implication that everybody else was doing irrational phonology. So now we've got logical phonology, with no implication, by the way, that everybody else is doing illogical phonology. It's called logical phonology for a reason that will become clear in a second. So the idea is that the melodic tier consists of linearly ordered bundles of segments, where segments are sets of binary features. And this is meant literally, so the axioms of set theory hold of segments, qua sets of binary features. And segments need not be specified for all features. And this is crucial, and it plays a role identical to the role for this notion suggested by Sharon Rose Inclus in 1996. The traditional notion of structural change associated with rule-based phonology, with the one that's conventionally symbolized by that beloved arrow, is broken down into more basic operations inspired by formal logic and taken from formal logic in many cases, hence the name logical phonology. The most important of these for our purposes is unification, which is symbolized by the cup operator, and it's defined by Dabus et al. 2025 in the following way. It's in my 20. Unification, if A and B are feature specifications and the union A unified with B is consistent, then A cut B equals the union of A and B. Otherwise, A cut B equals A. So it's this second part which makes it a little bit different from unification as described, as defined within unification-based syntactic frameworks, for example, where inconsistency usually leads to ungrammaticality. Here, it doesn't. It instead leads to the rule returning its input rather than doing anything significant. So importantly, we know in logical phonology, one never speaks of rules, at least unification rules, as in fact, rules in general, not just unification rules. One never speaks of them as not applying. Rules always apply. It's just that in many cases they apply vacuously. One case in which they apply vacuously is if their structural description is not met. Another place in which they might apply vacuously is if the structural description is met, but the result of performing the unification is inconsistent, and then that means that it ends up applying vacuously because it just returns its input. Likewise, because the axioms of set theory says that the set containing A and the set containing A and A are the same set, if you're unifying a feature bundle with a feature that it's already got with the same value for that feature, you're going to end up with the same set back again. So that's another way in which a rule might apply vacuously, right? Now, the specific appeal of logical phonology here is that the theory makes it possible to analyze both automatic and non-automatic alternations in the narrow phonology, while still observing a qualitative distinction between the two and without compromising strong modularity. So that particular combination of features, I haven't found anywhere else yet. Although, as we'll see, I may not have been looking at element theory hard enough. I certainly haven't been. But in any case, I think this is, at the moment, as from where I'm sitting, this is the best thing going at allowing me to do this. Automatic alternations in quality, so sort of fully productive rules that involve manipulation of the melodic tier, involve a pairing of a unification rule defined as in 20 with a subtraction rule. Subtraction rules involve set subtraction, symbolized by the / symbol over distinctive feature sets. So here's a definition of set subtraction from Dabus et al. 2025. Lowercase x is an element of the set x / y if lowercase x is a member of the set x, but capital X, and lowercase x is not an element of the set y. So you take X, you take out all of the members of X that are also members of Y, and then the result is the result of set subtraction. So a fully productive rule voicing obstruents after nasals, for example, which would be written as 22 in traditional rule-based phonology, might, in a logical phonology analysis, consist of the subtraction rule in 23, followed by the unification rule in 24. So a traditional SBE style rule would have plus obstruent goes to plus voice in the environment of plus nasal, and where goes to is signified by the arrow. In logical phonology, that's going to be a pairing of the rule in 23. So plus obstruent, subtract this minus voice in the environment of plus nasal. So if, in other words, if the obstruent contains minus voice, then you give back a set without that feature in it. If it doesn't contain that, then the rule applies vacuously, nothing happens. And then you've got a later rule which says, give me something that's plus obstruent and unify it with the feature plus voice. And that will apply non-vacuously in the event that the obstruent that you've started with has no specification for voice. It will apply vacuously otherwise. So if the thing you've started with is already plus voice, then obviously plus voice. The set containing plus voice is the same as the set containing just plus voice, so you get the same thing back. And if given that rule 23 exists, it won't contain the feature minus voice, of course. If there was a feature minus voice around, then 24 would apply vacuously because the result of performing this operation would then be inconsistent, and that means the rule returns its input per the definition of unification rules in TWECT, right? So that's automatic alternations. Automatic alternations involve set subtraction followed by unification. Non-automatic alternations in quality are still phonological, but they're qualitatively different in that instead they involve the conjunction of a special underlying representation, an underspecified underlying representation with a unification rule, okay? So, for example, assume the underlying representation P capital ID for the root of the verb pedir in Spanish, which means to request, where you'll recall that the capital I is a vowel specified for minus back, minus round, and minus low, but unspecified for the feature plus minus high. Then the unification rules on the next page, which are taken from Gorman and Rees 2024, will yield forms in PED when the following vowel is E and forms in PED otherwise. So you've got a rule that says, find me something which is minus back and minus low, unify it with the feature minus high, just in case the next syllable has in it a vowel which is minus back and plus high. And then you've got a unification rule which says, give me a minus low vowel and unify it with the feature plus high, right? For vowels that are that are already specified for plus minus high, the rules in 25 and 26 will always apply vacuously. They'll do nothing, right? Because for the reasons I've already given, just for those vowels that are underspecified for the feature plus minus high, will these rules get to do anything at all, okay? And the necessary ordering between 25 and 26 is given by Parnell's principle, the else were condition, okay? Because in an intuitively obvious way, the structural description, including the conditioning environment of Rule 25, contains that of Rule 26. Therefore, 25 is more specific than 26. Therefore, by the elsewhere condition, 25 must go off before 26 does, right? Note that I will slightly reformulate Rule 25 later on, but it will do the same thing. Now, as I mentioned, all non-alternating es and es in Spanish will be specified for the feature plus minus high underlyingly, so that the rules in 25 and 26 will apply to them vacuously. There we've got internal to the phonology, we've got automatic and non-automatic alternations. They're dealt with in the same module, but they're still qualitatively different because they involve the two different combinations of primitives that the theory makes available. Automatic alternations involve a subtraction rule paired with a unification rule. Non-automatic alternations involve an underspecified underlying representation and a unification rule, or one or more unification rules. So given that this is what the theory makes available, how does the acquirer go about constructing its URs? Well, a learner must presumably first establish whether a given alternation is automatic or not, presumably by means of the tolerance principle of Charles Yang, right? So in the event that the tolerance threshold is exceeded, the learner will conclude that the alternation is non-automatic. In that circumstance, it will proceed to construct an abstract underlying form by taking the intersection of the features of the surface alternants minus the ones with inconsistent values. This is the operation known as generalized intersection in work by Charles Rees, and you can see Unit 45 of Bale and Rees's 2018 textbook for an example. So in the case of a verb like pedir, the underlying capital I of the root will be arrived at from the two surface alternants, which are A and E, in the manner shown in my 27. So you've got a vowel which is minus low, minus high, minus back, minus round, and you've got another vowel which is minus low, plus high, minus back, minus round. If you perform generalized intersection on those two feature sets, you're going to get back the set containing minus low, minus back, minus round, and that's what's going to be in the underlying representation of this root, which exhibits this non-automatic vowel alternation. And that is all the logical phonology we need for this handout and for the one that corresponds to lecture 3. there will be a lot more underspecified vowels in lecture three. That's the one that goes on about Sumir and vowel alternations. But the actual mechanical pieces of technology are going to be the same in that lecture too, and we've seen them all now. Okay. I'll take a little pause before we move on to talk about the timings here. All right, so section 5.2 is called Assumptions about the Timing Tier, primer on strict CV, and how to make it talk to LP, logical phonology. Okay, here's the primer on strict CV. Strict CV, citations here to Lowenstein 1996 and Shear 2004, is a version of autosegmental phonology, Goldsmith 1976, in which the timing tier consists only of repeated CV units. In such a model, notions like onset, nucleus, and coda can't be defined in terms of constituent structure, as in more familiar theories of the syllable. Instead, such notions can only be reconstructed derivatively in terms of lateral relationships between C slots and V slots, and whether they are filled or not. For example, a nucleus is a filled V slot. Coda consonants generally correspond to a C with a filled V somewhere before it, immediately before it, if it's the first or only consonant in the coda, further away if it's later in the complex coda. But an unfilled V immediately after it. A simple onset is a C with a filled V slot immediately to its right. And a complex onset only arises under special circumstances, which will not be germane here. In strict CV, all facts which in other theories are dealt with in terms of constraints on constituents of syllable structure also have to be recast in terms of restrictions on when V and C slots are allowed to be unfilled, what they can be filled by, under what circumstances, and so on. This is implemented in terms of two lateral relationships, relations that can hold between C and V slots, inherited from government phonology. These are called government and licensing. Government and licensing have in common that they proceed from right to left on the standard view, that only filled timing slots can initiate them, and that they are mutually exclusive. So no timing slot can be simultaneously governed and licensed. In situations where both government and licensing could apply to a given item, government takes priority. Filled V slots can govern and license things on their left. An empty V slot can govern and license only if it is the final position in the final position of the relevant domain. So empty final nuclei are special in that they act as if they're filled even when they're not. Filled C slots cannot license, and they can govern only in a special circumstance called infrasegmental government, which plays no role in this analysis. That is the special circumstance under which you can get complex onsets. What will play a big role here is the notion of an ungoverned empty V slot. These, given my adoption of the updated version of the analysis in Harris 1985, developed by Biberauer 2023, will drive the explanation of diphthongization, which is another one of the crucial non-automatic alternations. Crucial to PYTA only insofar as it applies to the theme vowel of the third conjugation, as we'll see, but it's important nevertheless. And there you have all the strict CV you need to understand the analysis that you're going to see here and in lecture 3 on Sumiran. Okay. Section 5.2.2 is an excursus on making strict CV and logical phonology talk to one another, which I will begin after taking another sip of coffee. Now, logical phonology has by this point a fairly rich literature on the nature of the melodic tier, but it has no standard line on the nature of the timing tier yet. That's something that's being actively worked on, in particular by Kyle Gorman, I know, and Charles Rees as well, and perhaps others. Strict CV, on the other hand, has so much to say about the timing tier that it's named after it. With respect to the melodic tier, though, it's usually paired with element theory. And I don't wish to dismiss the possibility that element theoretic versions of the analyses to be presented here and in lecture 3 could be developed. I've stuck with logical phonology for now because its use of unification rules applying to underspecified representations has a big payoff, both here and in lecture 3. And the logic of those accounts relies on having binary features, which is not what element theory has. Element theory has unary features. And so reformulating the analyses in its terms is non-trivial. It would take someone with a better command of element theory than I have to make a meaningful attempt at this, I'm afraid. And so I haven't, but someone should. And just because I couldn't work out how it works, um, shouldn't discourage anybody else from trying. I'm not the right person for that particular job. So, but anyway, as far as I know, no one else other than me has tried to combine strict CV and logical phonology in the way that I'm doing here. And it's possible that that's because what I'm trying to do is silly. It could be that there's like some fundamental logical incompatibility that arises somewhere that other people have seen. But I don't think so. At least I haven't come across one yet. There is one serious technical issue that I'm about to talk about. But arguably, it's present in vanilla strict CV anyway, and is merely highlighted by trying to combine it with logical phonology, rather than actually arising from that attempt. And here it is. So in many analyses, including the ones to come, C and V slots have to know that they are unfilled. That's a loose way of talking. What I mean is that rules often apply just in case a given C or V slot is unfilled. So the rule has to know that they're unfilled. Likewise, floating segments and floating features often have to know that they are not linked to the timing tier. That is, there are rules that apply just in case such and such a thing is not linked to the timing tier. And this seems to imply the ability to refer to an absence, the lack of an association line, and that doesn't work. You can't write rules that do that, not really. So that's a problem. But as I say, it's implicit in strict CV anyway, actually. And often there's a sort of acknowledgement of this you see that's implicit in the way that some rules in government phonology type analyses and strict CV analyses are formulated. So you'll often see, say, apenthesis rules written to, do such and such a thing just in case the vowel is minus gov, right? Where minus gov is a feature that appears in the rule. So the vowel knows that it's in this relation somehow, right? So it's a similar issue. So here is the technical solution I propose to this technical problem. After every rule that creates or destroys an association line, the following battery of rules will apply. In these rules, capital X varies over timing slots, C and V. Lowercase x varies over feature bundles on the melodic tier. All rules seeming to refer to an unfilled timing slot are to be understood as referring to the feature minus filled, which is introduced by some of these rules. All rules seeming to refer to a floating segment or feature bundle are to be understood as referring to the feature minus linked. All right. So here are these rules. Rule 28 subtracts the feature plus minus filled from everything on the timing slot. Rule 29 subtracts the feature plus or minus linked from everything on the melodic tier. 30 is a unification rule sensitive to the presence of an association line. So for capital X on the timing tier and lowercase x on the melodic tier, which are linked to each other by our association line, unify capital X with plus filled and unify lowercase x with plus linked. Okay. And then crucially ordered after that rule are rule 31, which unifies capital X with minus filled, and rule 32, which unifies lowercase x with minus linked, right? Those two rules will apply vacuously to all those rules that have been affected by, to all of those elements that have been affected by rule 30. So everything that's been affected by rule 30 will be plus filled or plus linked. And so rules 31 and 32 respectively will apply vacuously to them. To everything else, which will have no value for these features, they will be filled in with minus filled and minus linked, right? And so those things will know that they have no association line linking them to anything else. That's the solution. Okay. So that's it. Except that, given that I'm talking about the timing tier now, now is a good time to talk about my assumptions about stress. And here we encounter an area in which a small retreat from the spirit of strict modularity, although I don't think the letter of strict modularity is necessary. So Spanish verb stress is extremely well, copiously studied, and almost everyone agrees that some amount of at least indirect reference to morphosyntactic structure is necessary in any analysis of it. And here I've got a small sample of the literature illustrating this, citations to it, that is, Donner 2017, Halle et al. 1991, Harris 1969, 1980, 1985, and 1987, Ultra Massuet and Arregui 2005, Rocca 2005, Rocca 2020. Many others I could have listed. So the form that this is going to take is in the present analysis is as follows. As part of the transduction from syntactic structure to phonology, alongside the rules of exponence, which are obviously part of that transduction, a choice is made about the set of stress rules to be employed. Likewise, particular cyclic domains may be special in the set of timing tier manipulating rules that they do and don't invoke. So this is a rule-based implementation of a limited form of the cophonologies by phase or by phrase approach, summarized in Sandy et al. 2020. I'm going to take it that stress assignment takes place in two steps. The first is called accent assignment, which identifies a specific, in Spanish, filled V-slot as metrically prominent. And the second is called CV infixation, which inserts an empty CV sequence to the immediate right of the accented V slot. And this has been a staple of the CV literature since Larson 1998. Now, since these are two different steps, in principle, other processes can intervene between them, and that's going to be critical later on. Furthermore, their separateness raises the possibility that they could be applicable to different cyclic domains. And I'm going to take advantage of that possibility too. So I'll propose below that while accent assignment takes place on every cycle, CV infixation crucially does not take place during the cycle defined by the head that introduces external arguments in the syntax, whether you want to call that V star or voice or something else. As for how accent assignment itself takes place, I'm going to adapt the proposal of Doner 2017, which is itself an extension of the system in Rocca 2005, which analysis employs the fundaments of the Halley-Izzardi metrical system, but extends it to allow for edge marking parameters on line 0. These edge marking parameters may vary in different morphosyntactic environments, and that's where the tiny bit of a retreat from strict modularity is going to occur. Basically, in the transduction to phonology, you're going to select one of the relevant edge marking rules and some other things, as we'll see. Here's the algorithm as presented by Doner 2017 on page 242 of that paper. I've left out, that is, I have omitted a constraint on foot construction on line 1, since it doesn't play a role in my analysis. So here are the rules for line 0. You've got the edge marking rules, which are parameterized. So put an X bracket to the X side of the rightmost element. Iterative constituent construction is set to L, so that inserts a left bracket after every second element proceeding from right to left. And then line 0 has its head on the left. The parameters for line 1, the edge marking rule inserts a right parenthesis to the right of the rightmost element. Line 1 has its head on the right, and there's a rule of conflation that conflates line 1 at the end of the duration, which will ensure that there's no secondary stresses. In place of Donner's domain parameters for the edge marking rule, so Donner has additional conventions which make certain syllables extrametrical for the purposes of the edge marking rules, which are an independent sort of parameter that's picked on the basis of the morphosyntactic features. I've left those aside, and I'm instead going to allow for a boundary for the application of the edge marking rule to be specified in the underlying representation of certain affixes, and that's represented by a single curly bracket like this, right? So those curly brackets indicate to the edge marking rule, do not look beyond this point when thinking about where you're going to put your edge mark. I'm also going to allow URs to contain lexically projecting left parentheses for cases that seem to call for underlying accented endings. So, for example, the first singular and third singular presser indicative endings, e/e, depending on conjugation class, and o, those are stressed in verbs with regular presserets. And those are going to involve the affix itself having in its underlying representation as a specification that it projects a left parenthesis to line 0 underlyingly. With these ideas in place, the line 0 edge marking rules for Spanish verbs can be simplified from Donna's discussion to what I've got in 35 with one additional complication that's discussed in appendices B and E. Here they are, line 0 edge marking rules for Spanish verb conjugation. The default one is put a right parenthesis to the right of the rightmost element. The special one, which occurs in the infinitive and plural positive imperative, instead places a left parenthesis to the left of the rightmost element. That's going to give you final stress, basically. To simplify the discussion in section 5.3, so section 5.3 introduces the rules in the phonological part of the analysis via sample derivations. To simplify those derivations and that whole discussion, the result of accent assignment in that section of the handout is going to be indicated by bolding and underlining the accented V slot rather than showing the full calculation for each case. And I've got some sample calculations here for you just to illustrate how this is supposed to work. And for the actual thing, you can just trust that this works as I say it does. I'll walk through these here. I skipped over these in the actual lecture, but I'm splitting this up a bit more, so there's more time here. For Pidieron, this one involves the normal edge marking rule. So edge marking puts in this right parenthesis here on line 0. Iterative foot construction, it puts a left parenthesis here and nowhere else because there's no further second asterisk over here on line 0. Line 0 is left-headed, so you project up here. The edge marking rule on line 1 puts a parenthesis there. There's no other prominence on line 1, so this is going to be the accented syllable as desired. Here in 37, we've got a calculation for the form pedir, which is the infinitive of the verb to request. This has a special edge marking rule. It assigns a left parenthesis to the left of the rightmost syllable, so that gives you this. Iterative foot construction can't do anything because there's no binary feet to make. Line 0 is left-headed, but that's vacuously applicable here. And so the stress syllable is going to be the final one. This final nucleus here is going to end up with stress on it. Here's a somewhat more complicated form in 38, pedíamos, we request, imperfect indicative. So this has the default edge marking rule, but the imperfect indicative TAM marker, the vocabulary item corresponding to it, has underlyingly a special edge marking boundary indicated by this curly bracket here. And that means that when the edge marking rule applies, it looks no further than this asterisk. It ignores this one. So this asterisk here that I'm waving my cursor around is the rightmost element. So edge marking is going to put its bracket, its parenthesis to the immediate right of that thing. Iterative foot construction is going to place a left parenthesis here, and then line 0 is left-headed. And so it's the theme vowel that's then going to the theme vowel of the verb pedir, which is going to end up stressed in that circumstance, right? And finally, calculation 39 shows you an instance with an underlying left parenthesis, which is highlighted here. So this is pidió, he or she requested, preterite indicative. And here the TAM marker, this is an actual, the or here is a manifestation of the TAM marker, which is sensitive to the feature third person singular. And it projects a left parenthesis on line 0 underlyingly, right? So you've got an underlyingly accented syllable. And that's here highlighted in yellow. The edge marking rule is the default one, so that puts a right parenthesis here that you can see. Iterative foot construction will put a bracket over here. So we've got 2 feet at line 0. The head is on the left on line 0, so you've got an asterisk projected here, an asterisk projected there. Line 1 has its head on the right, and so that has the result that the final syllable is going to be stressed as desired. Okay, so that's it. That's all of the assumptions about the timing tier, including those that pertain to how stress assignment is calculated. And that takes place in 2 steps. We've just seen how accent assignment works, okay? And then the second step involved in stress is infixing a CV, an empty CV sequence to the immediate right of the accented syllable as chosen by these calculations, okay? Little pause before we get onto section 5.3, which is the real engine room of the paper, actually. Yes, so a little bit more coffee, I think. I suggest that you drink some as well for this. Right, so section 5.3. It's called Key Rules and Sample Derivations. For reference, in my 40 here, I've got rules of exponents that are relevant to the sample derivations. I'll talk you through just a handful of these here, not all of them. We've got 3 roots that we're going to look at. These are the root for the verb request, which is PID with an underlying underspecified front unrounded non-low vowel, which is underspecified for plus minus high. The root of the verb to serve in 40b has that same vowel inside of it. So it's a sirb underlyingly. The verb that means boil in 50c has the same feature bundle in it, but it also, in addition, has an empty CV sequence on the timing tier in its underlying representation. And that's going to capture the fact that erbir, which is to boil, is a diphthongizing verb, where servir, which means to serve, is not a diphthongizing verb. Default verbalizers spelled out as nothing. Verbalizer, future conditional, spells out as a floating CV sequence. So that's going to be pertinent to our discussion of a couple of conditional forms, I think, are discussed in one of these derivations. The third conjugation theme vowel is a floating vowel, underspecified for plus minus high, but specified for minus back and minus low and minus round. Tam markers, the present indicative is 0. The present subjunctive for second and third conjugation verbs is a floating a. The imperfect indicative marker for the same 2 conjugation classes is a linked a, which projects a edge marking barrier to the timing tier. There are 2 preterite indicative markers here, 40J and 40K. One that goes off in the environment where the agreement head has third person singular features on it. That's the one that inserts this accented O. The other one goes off when the agreement marker is third person plural, and that inserts ro. We'll have a derivation for the imperfect subjunctive in se, so that tam morpheme spells out as se, which projects a curly bracket, a right curly bracket to the timing tier. So that's a boundary for the edge marking rule. The infinitive marker is in 40. This has a little sign on it saying I pick the special edge marking rule. And then we've got an adjectivalizer, nte, the third person singular agreement marker, which is 0, the third person plural agreement marker, which is n, and the first person plural marker, mos, which are all straightforward. Everything in there is linked to the timing tier, no funny business. Yeah. Okay, here we go. We're going to introduce the rule system, as I said, via sample derivations. And the first and most important sample derivation here is the one corresponding to the verb form Biberauer, which is they requested. So the third person plural preterite indicative of the verb pedir, to request. The syntax of that is given to you in 41 here. So this is pretty straightforward, I think. You've got request with the verbalizer, theme vowel, tam marker, plural agreement, third person plural agreement. The rules of exponents that we've just discussed spell out the root as the root request as CV with the first 3 timing slots linked respectively to per, it, and de. The verbalizer is null, so it has no impact on this. The theme vowel is spelled out as this floating capital I. The tam marker is preterite indicative, spells out as raw linked to a C and a V here, and then the third person plural agreement marker is an N that's also linked to the timing clearance here. So the whole underlying representation is this thing that you can see on the screen. Okay. The first rule to apply to this form will be floating vowel association, which is formulated in 42. This proceeds right to left. The reason why it has to do that will not be obvious from this derivation, but it will become crucial when we look at the derivation of pidamos, which is we request present subjunctive later on. 43 gives you the result of that. Very simple. There's a new association line now linking the theme vowel to the timing tier. The output of that rule is the input to the rule of accent assignment in my 44, which says calculate which V slot bears accent, and that's done as illustrated in the previous section. The result of that is illustrated in my 45 by the bolding and underlining of the V slot that's assigned accent by that rule, and you can see that it's the one that's linked to the theme vowel. Now, it turns out that the vowel represented by capital I never surfaces as e when it's accented. When it carries the accent, capital I always surfaces either as e or as ye, the diphthong, okay? The rule in 46 accounts for the first of these outputs. So 46's name is capital I becomes e when accented. And what this says is take a minus back minus low vowel, unify it with plus high, just in case it's linked to a V slot that bears accent. Okay. Applying that rule to the output of the previous step gives you the step in my 47. And what you can see here now is just that capital I in the theme vowel has changed into lowercase I. So it's now specified plus high. Now, the diphthongal alternate of accented I is derived by having the output of that rule be the input to a rule of accented I lengthening. And this rule is the most important rule in the entire analysis. And in its specifics, it's original to me. The basic insight, though, I discovered had been floating around for quite a long time. So the basic generalization about the relevant segment sequences here is to be found, I think, in Foley 1965, in particular pages 91 to 100, Harris 1969, page 186, here's 25, and Bremen-Bordois 1973. Bremen-Bordois 1973 are the closest to my formulation. So I think Foley's and Harris's have at least some morphological features mentioned in their rules. Bremen-Bordois don't. They had, I think, discovered the basic segment generalization here. What they lacked was a way of making it apply in such a way that it wouldn't overgenerate inside roots in particular. So you want to make sure that this only happens to the theme vowel, but without mentioning theme vowel, right? And Bremen-Bordois don't quite achieve that. And the reason that they couldn't was that they didn't have access to the sorts of fine-grained assumptions about the melodic tier and the timing tier that I now have access to, thanks to the logical phonologists and the strict CV phonologists, right? Now, this rule, accented I lengthening, has two subcases which could very easily be collapsed using the brace notation. But I haven't done this for typographical and legibility related reasons, but this is one rule really, okay? Accented I lengthening, subcase 1. This is my 48. Here is the prose description. It's a bit dense. Insert a CV sequence immediately after an accented V slot linked to a plus high, minus low, minus back melody. Immediately preceding a C slot filled by a coronal fricative, followed immediately by a V slot filled by a minus low melody, which is specified for plus minus high. Okay, that's what that says. Subcase 2 is in my 49. Insert a CV sequence immediately after an accented V slot linked to a plus high, minus low, minus back vowel melody, immediately preceding a C slot filled by a coronal sonorant, such that the next filled V slot to its right has a minus low melody and is specified for plus minus high. So here, this is an explanation of it, an exposition of what this rule does that I came up with on the fly during the lecture, and which I'm going to attempt to replicate now. So here's how this rule works, okay? So you find an accented E, and you look to its right, and you check first to see if what's right next to it is a consonant on the melodic tier, which is linked to a consonant slot on the timing tier, right? If what's next to you is a floating vowel or anything else, anything floating at all on that tier, you immediately stop. The rule's not going to go off, okay? If, however, there's nothing there, you go along, you find this consonant, right? You check to see if it's coronal. If it's not coronal, you stop. You're not going to do anything. If it's coronal, you check to see if it's a stop. If it's a stop, you stop. You don't do anything, right? If it's not a stop, you then check to see whether it's a fricative or a sonorant. If it's a fricative, then you immediately make sure that there's the next thing, the next filled slot, timing slot to its right is a vowel and not a consonant. Because if there's another consonant there, you're going to stop. You're not going to do anything, right? If it's a sonorant, then it's okay if there's a filled consonant slot next to the right. Okay. And then once you've decided that, you look at the next vowel and you ask, first of all, is it minus low? If it's plus low, do nothing, throw it out. If it's plus low, sorry, that is, if it is minus low, then you're okay. You then check to see if it has a height specification. If it does, then you apply the rule. If it doesn't, you stop. Okay. One of the crucial things here, one of the most crucial things is one of the first things I said. Nothing, not even something floating, may intervene between this accented vowel and the next consonant. That guarantees that this rule will never go off in the event that there's a floating vowel next to it. And that means that it won't go off inside roots if the theme vowel is floating. And that's crucial, for example, for forms like discussed in here in this footnote 4. So take the form biso, which is the first person singular indicative form of pisar, which is to step on something, right? That's underlyingly piece followed by a floating A, followed by a floating O, okay? It surfaces as biso, not as pieso. Why? Well, despite the fact that this is a coronal fricative, and despite the fact that this is a vowel, that O is a vowel with a height specification, which is not low, which itself is not low, you don't get pieso. And the reason why you don't incorrectly get pieso is that there's a floating A on the timing tier in that derivation that blocks it, right? Likewise, if you're dealing with a root and you are seeing if this rule is going to apply, and the root ends in a coronal fricative or a coronal sonorant, optionally followed by a vowel, followed by another consonant, and you're in the third conjugation, then accented eye lengthening will not go off because it can't be triggered by the theme vowel at the crucial point in the derivation, because at the crucial point in the derivation, that theme vowel, which will be unaccented, of course, will have no height specification. And so you can't have it going off in roots either. So basically, this rule as written is guaranteed not to affect anything other than the third conjugation theme vowel, but it doesn't mention the third conjugation theme vowel. It's formulated in purely phonological terms, okay? So it doesn't violate strict modularity. And crucially, it affects forms that are outside the PYTA morpheme, in particular the gerund, and also certain derivatives of the relevant verbs. So the adjective forming suffix nte is also a trigger for this rule as well, and that's not part of the PYTA morpheme. So this is going to get you the diphthongal alternate of the theme vowel in a way that doesn't put diphthongs where you don't want them, and which crucially doesn't mention theme vowel in its formulation, and which, as I say, generalizes beyond the morphomic pattern. So it's not ad hoc in that sense. It's not there just to account for the PYTA pattern. It does more work in Spanish phonology, and something that has its effect, even if you don't like this, something that has its effect is going to be needed in Spanish phonology, okay? Because of the raw fact of the distribution of this diphthongal alternate. Okay, that's the most important rule in the entire fragment. What it does here, so in this particular derivation, subcase 2 of accented eye lengthening is going to apply because the is a sonorant underlyingly, and that's going to give you 50, right? So now you've got an extra CV sequence empty on the timing tier immediately after this accented vowel. The next step is going to be CV in fixation. So this inserts an empty CV sequence to the immediate right of the accented V slot, right? That gives you, that's the rule in 51 and gives you the representation of 52. Okay. Now in 52, we've got an ungoverned V slot. It's here. It's highlighted in yellow. Okay. because the V slot immediately to its right is unfilled, it's empty, and that's not a final nucleus, right? The final nucleus is over here. So this V here, the highlighted one, is ungoverned. That's going to trigger a rule of epenthesis. The rule of epenthesis is in 53. Insert air into an ungoverned V slot. That applies left to right in Spanish, as we know, because snob in English was borrowed into Spanish as esnob and not as senob. Now, following and adopting and slightly adapting the account in Pérez Herrera 2023, which is itself an updating of the account in Harris 1985, epenthesis here is going to trigger a couple of other rules. One is called accent displacement, which says, and it's in my 54, if an accented non-low vowel is followed by a V slot filled by air and no filled C or V slots intervene, move the accent onto the air, right? So this is going to take our accented E, move the accent along onto air. This is just an updating of a rule in Harris 1985. 55 is the rule of gliding. Associate a linked non-low vowel to a following empty C slot if the next filled V slot is accented and no filled C slot intervenes. So that's going to have the effect of turning the theme vowel itself here. Theme vowel is not mentioned in the rule, but it's going to have the effect of making the theme vowel into a glide. So that gives you the telescoping of those three steps gives you 56. So you've got Pedieron, where this I is linked simultaneously to this V slot and this C slot, and that makes it a glide. And now we've got accent here, Pedieron. Okay. The next two rules to consider are 57 and 58. 57 is a reformulation of that rule from Gorman and Rees 2024, the one that was back in 25. Now, 57 is a rule that we all need in the system. What it says is unify a minus low vowel with a -5 feature just in case the next filled V slot to its right is filled by E. And the way this is written here guarantees that a glide isn't going to trigger this. So if there is a C slot here, it must be filled by something which is linked to a separate consonant, not linked to this V slot, right? So that means that the relevant vowel to look at in applying Rule 57 to the representation in 56 is this one. And that vowel there, that V slot is not filled with E, it's filled with E, okay? So Rule 57 is going to apply vacuously because its structural description is not there, its conditioning environment isn't there, okay? So that means 58 will apply instead. 58 says elsewhere, underspecified capital I and capital U become E and U respectively. So this says unify the feature plus high with a minus low feature bundle. And remember, all of the non-alternating vowels, all the vowels that don't undergo the specific alternations, are going to be fully specified for plus or minus high. So 57 and 58 are both guaranteed to apply vacuously to all of those vowels. It's just the underspecified vowels, the special vowels, that are going to be affected by 57 or 58 in any circumstance. Anyway, what does this do? What that's going to do is 58 is going to apply non-vacuously to the underspecified vowel in the stem, right? And that's going to give you what you've got in my 59 here, which is the output you want, modulo the automatic sparentization rules, which I haven't included here, but that's going to give you Pedieron, and that's the end of the derivation, okay? So there's a sample derivation for PVSN next, which I skipped in the actual lecture and which I will skip here too. The only thing that's different about this one, the only thing that's different about it is that it's subcase 1 of accented I lengthening that applies, right? Because this is a coronal fricative, right? And crucially, when it's a coronal fricative, you can't have it be followed by another consonant, and that's why the second person singular preterite indicative form of this verb is pediste and not pedieste, right? So you don't get diphthongization there, and that's because although you do have a coronal fricative there, what's next is not a vowel, it's a consonant, and that violates the conditioning environment of the rule, and so the rule will apply vacuously and nothing will happen, right? So other than that, nothing to say about PVSN. You can read through this sample derivation in your own time if you like. PVND involves the same rules applying non-vacuously as Peverelli, with one addition. The instructive aspect of this form lies in motivating the additional optional material in the conditioning environment of subcase 2 of accented eye lengthening, right? So this shows you it going off in the case where you've got a coronal sonorant followed by a consonant. It also illustrates that epenthesis may be triggered before CV and fixation. And it also has a role for the rule of empty VC deletion, which applies at the end of every derivation. And that's introduced, it's a staple of the CV literature, and it comes from Guzman and Kate, 1993. I now think that the assumptions that I was making about coda clusters, or rather consonant clusters such that at least the first consonant is in the coda, work in Spanish, which I'm going to incorporate into a revised version of the manuscript. Because if you think about it, given the distribution of ungoverned vowels that you will end up with, the way things are set up here, you might get epenthesis in a lot more places than you actually do in Spanish. So what I actually think now is that coda nasals, for example, are representationally glides, so that they occupy a V slot to the left as well as the C slot that dominates them. And later we'll see. So that has as one consequence that you get less epenthesis than you would otherwise get desirably. And also it suggests a way of accounting for which consonants trigger sparentization in voice stops that follow them, which ones don't. So the idea will be that those consonants after which you get sparentization are glides that associate with the following V slot, and sparentization is triggered by a preceding filled V slot. And those that block sparentization, like N, for example, are ones that link to a V slot to the left. If that's true, then the way that this derivation proceeds will work a bit differently, but it will still come out correctly. But let's walk through how it is here. Okay, so we've got underlying PID in te, where the I is floating because it's the theme vowel. Step 1 is floating vowel association. That's in my 69. Step 2 is in my 70. That's accent assignment. Step 3 is in my 71. That's a typo there. So this should be capital I. So capital I becomes E when accented. Okay. The next step in my 72 is accented I lengthening. That's going to insert that's extra CV syllable, which will be ungoverned here in this circumstance because the next V slot along is not filled. The assumption I make here is that epenthesis applies at once, and that gives you this representation in my 73, where you've got an air in that slot there. CV and fixation applies next. That's in my 64. Accent displacement and gliding that apply. That gives you 75. In 76, the unification rule that unifies a minus low vowel with plus high applies to the capital I in the stem. That gives you the representation in 76 here. MTVC reduction applies. You take an MTVC sequence and delete it, and that gives you 78, which is the output modulo sparentization. After sparentization, you get PVND, is what you want. Now, yeah, that's fine. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Here's Pidamos. This sample derivation is pretty straightforward, but it's included to show how the crucial idea that floating vowel association applies right to left comes in. So this is the first person plural present subjunctive of the verb pedir. And it has the syntax in UR given in my 79, and you can see that there are two floating vowels on the melodic tier here. One is the theme vowel, and the other is the realization of the present subjunctive TAM morpheme. And because floating vowel association applies right to left, that means that the theme vowel is going to just be left floating in this derivation. It's not going to be pronounced. The art is. So step 81 shows you accent assignment. Step 82 shows you CV fixation, which doesn't give rise to any ungoverned vowels in this case, right? The structural description and conditioning environment of accented I lengthening is not met here. There's no accented I, right? No accented capital I. Sorry, no accented I at all. And then in 83, you've got step 4 on the output. So unification rule 58 applies to the vowel in the stem and vacuously to the floating theme vowel. And that gives you, after sparentization, didamos, right? Okay, so that's that form here. Section 5.3.5 illustrates a sample derivation with a crucial role for cyclicity. And that's the derivation of bedirian they would request. I think this has to go in 2 cycles, in particular because given that this, like, just look at the surface form, right? Bedirian, right? Recall that the theme vowel is underlyingly unspecified for plus minus high. And so too, of course, is the stem vowel, okay? Now, if you were processing this all in one go, then you would expect the high vowel in the ending, bedirian, to cause the theme vowel to be low, or rather, sorry, it would cause the theme vowel to be minus high, right? Which you in turn might expect to cause the stem vowel to be plus high. And that would give you piderian, which is not what you want, right? So having a cycle of phonological rules apply just over the infinitive component here avoids that problem. And also, where you might undesirably have got epenthesis of the theme vowel, epenthesis after the theme vowel here, that won't happen here because of the assumption that I said I was going to make earlier, which is that although accent assignment applies on every cycle, strict CV and fixation doesn't apply on the verbalizer cycle, right? The cycle corresponding to the thematic domain. So that's going to be crucial. Anyway, we'll do a little pause here before I actually start this. I'm going to have a bit of coffee again. All right, so you've got the syntax in 84. This is the infinitive portion of this conditional form. Got your UR there. 85 shows you the result of floating vowel association and accent assignment, which in this case, because the infinitive marker has a special edge marking rule associated with it, will get you accent on the theme vowel. Accented I becomes E, gives you the representation in my 86, right? So this vowel here is now plus high. The underspecified vowel in the stem is still unspecified at this stage. The structural description of accented I lengthening is not met by this representation. No vowel follows the R, right? No filled vowel slot. And you need a vowel slot that's filled by a non-low vowel specified for height to trigger that rule. The structural description of CV in fixation is met at this point, but I crucially propose that this rule never applies on the VP cycle. This idea will, I believe, also play a role in enabling the present approach to sidestep the so-called problem of the missing cycle in a manner similar to Halley et al. 1991, though I haven't worked that out all the way yet. The next rule whose structural description is met is the unification rule assigning minus high to the next non-glide V slot. Assigning minus high when the next non-glide V slot is filled by E. That's true here. And so the vowel in the stem of pedir is going to be unified with minus high. So that's going to give us pedir as the output of that step. And that concludes the first cycle, right? The start of the second cycle will look as in my 85. So you've got a empty CV sequence that corresponds to the future conditional builder. You've got a floating theme vowel, right? You've got a linked CV, which, as we know, has a special edge marking boundary associated with it. That's the imperfect marker, right? Then you've got the agreement marker for third person plural, right? So this is the future conditional builder, the third conjugation theme vowel, the imperfect indicative marker that corresponds to that conjugation class, That's the tense aspect mood marker here. And then the agreement marker for third person plural, because this is a form that means they would request. Okay. Floating vowel association, crucially ordered before a parenthesis, will apply, followed by a cycle of the accent assignment rules. So that's a parochial stipulated rule ordering. Edo Cavirani made a very interesting suggestion that maybe there's a general principle of sort of like use what you've got. So here you have something that's floating on the timing tier that can solve your government problem for you. So you make use of that rather than appendicizing. So that might be, if that's a general principle of sort of like resource management, then maybe this doesn't have to be a parochial rule ordering statement after all. But in any case, the ordering is crucial. However, it may be more deeply explained. So floating vowel association applies here. And that means that this formerly ungoverned V slot is now governed, and the need for a parenthesis is averted. That's a representation in My89 at the bottom of page 27 of the handout. If you're not sure what I'm on about by the problem of the missing cycle, see Bermúdez-Otero 2013, where the problem is given its name, and Bermúdez-Otero 2016, where Bermúdez-Otero quite correctly criticizes an early attempt of mine from 2015 to dissolve the problem of the missing cycle. I think that this here points the way to something that will actually work, but I haven't worked that out all the way. But Bermúdez-Otero was perfectly right that what I said in 2015 will not work. So 90 here shows you the result of doing accented I. Again, this should be capitalized, sorry. Becoming E, so make your accented capital I become an actual E, and doing CV infixation. There are no ungoverned vowels here. So this is an empty V slot, but it's governed by the vowel to its right. This is an empty V slot, but it's governed by the vowel to its right. This is an empty V slot, but it's the final nucleus in the domain, and that doesn't need to be governed. So a parenthesis is not triggered here. The representation in 90 will form the input to empty VC reduction, after which automatic spirantization rules will yield the output, which is Beririan. Yeah. There we go. That's where the cycle comes in. Section 5.4 has sample derivations to illustrate how these highly similar underlying representations for the roots of the verb ervir and servir, respectively, like capital I, floating empty CV sequence, R, B, and so that's the underlying representation of the verb that means to boil, and S, capital I, RB, which is the underlying representation for the root that means serve, interact with the rule system to give rise to some additional alternations. In these forms, I assume that the coda R is linked to the V slot following it, making it representationally a glide. That's in the UR here. I think that probably has to be derived by rule, actually. So what I'm going to have is rules of rightward or leftward disguised gliding, depending on whether it's a consonant that triggers spirantization or not. But this, as well as preventing what would otherwise be a source of overgeneration involving a parenthesis. So if you had a parenthesis applying in a way that's prevented by this assumption about R, then you would end up with erbir having its diphthong throughout its paradigm. So you'd have yervir as the infinitive. And servir would have diphthongs in parts of its paradigm, even though it doesn't really, right? So this assumption that R's are representationally glides averts that overgeneration and also points a way of formulating the spirantization rules pretty easily. So basically, they will apply just in case the voiced obstruent in question, the voiced stop in question, is preceded by a full V slot. I'm not going to walk through these sample derivations in full because there's literally nothing original in them. This is literally just an updating, a recapitulation of Perez Herrera's updating of Harris 1985. So I shall just skip this. There is one final rule that's introduced here that's important, and that's that whenever underspecified I is post-tonic, it becomes e. So that accounts for why in the present tense of third conjugation verbs, you only get it surfacing as e when it's accented, and in all of the other forms where you can see it, like vives, vive, viven, it comes out as e. That's rule 96. Okay. But otherwise, these are fairly self-explanatory and don't have much in the way of anything original, really. So I'll just skip past them. All right, so interim conclusion. This section has introduced phonological rules which cover a significant portion of the non-automatic vowel alternations in Spanish. This system derives the vowel alternation related aspects of the PYTA pattern as a special case, as summarized in 113, which is repeated in adapted form from number 7 earlier in the handout. So 113, explanation of the vowel alternations which produce and go beyond PYTA. 113a, the underlying vowel, capital I, undergoes diphthongization when stressed and followed by specific combinations of segments detailed in the 2 subcases of accented I lengthening. 113b, the underlying vowel, capital I, surfaces as E when stressed in all environments not covered by the previous statement. 113c, the underlying vowel, capital I, surfaces as E when post-tonic, so that's what happens in rhizotonic forms of third conjugation verbs. 113d, the underlying vowels, capital I and capital U, surfaces minus high when they are unstressed, and the next vowel to its right is E. I didn't show you any sample derivations with verbs that have capital U in them, but you can see the manuscript, and if you know Spanish, you'll know the type of thing I'm talking about. So the underlying vowels, capital I and capital U, surfaces minus high when they are unstressed, and the next vowel to the right is E. The next sort of like syllable nucleus is E. And finally, 113e, the underlying vowels, capital I and capital U, surfaces plus I when they are unstressed elsewhere. And that's it. All of that, everything in 113 is in its formulation entirely phonological, right? No morphosyntactic terminology in there at all. All of it has some role in explaining at least some parts of the non-automatic vowel alternation phonology of Spanish beyond the PYTA morpho. Okay, so here's the punchline, the conclusion in section 6. Once you've said what you have to say to cover the distribution of the relevant stem and theme vowel allomorphs in Spanish, there's no work left for a direct statement of the PYTA morpheme to do. The PYTA morpho to do. Relevant suppletive stem allomorphs are conditioned by a coherent morphosyntactic environment, minus present plus finite. Theme vowel alternations and internal vowel alternations in the roots of third conjugation verbs are governed by phonology. Both components of this explanation do work beyond the claimed morphomic pattern. That is, they are needed anyway, and are not just ad hoc devices specifically aimed at accounting for PYTA. And this is the best bit of this. Even if you don't believe the way that I've accounted for these patterns here, you could plug in your own account of the patterns and you will still be liberated from PYTA, right? So recall the big questions from the very, very beginning of this lecture 1, part 1 of debriefing of lecture 2, right? There was a big question about pieces, a big question about paradigms. The big question about pieces is reproduced in my 114 here. Is the input to the rules of exponents A, syntactic, a syntactic or at least syntax-like hierarchical structure as on piece-based views, or B, an unstructured bag of features as on word-based views? 115, another big question about paradigms. Are rules of exponents A, sensitive only to information in the structure that they are exponing? Or are they also B, potentially sensitive to the way other structures are realized via transderivational principles that regulate form correspondences? Big conclusion, if I'm right, the PYTA morpheme cannot be cited as forcing the B answers. And there's a clear implied research program here, which is to go around and show that claimed morphemes are all either piece-based, like the English past or passive participle, which raised no issue of principle for a theory that properly recognizes the autonomy of syntax, or alternatively, that they are spurious, which PYTA is in Spanish, as I've shown. Thank you for listening.